Okay, so the first step here in converting over our full stack friend tracker application to use Firebase Auth is to add some of the key components to our application that are required in pretty much every user authenticated application. So the main components that I'm talking about here are going to be our login page, which we're going to need to create here. Okay, that'll just take the user's email and password and allow them to log in. And we're also going to create a create account page. Now, the create account page for this is going to be a little bit more complex than what we've seen earlier, because basically, in addition to getting the user's email, password, and confirm password, we're also going to need to collect things like their name, their age, their bio, their interests, etc. And basically, we're going to need to add that to the request that we end up sending to the server when the user wants to create their account. So let's get started building those two pages, and we could start off by copying and pasting these from the example application that we did previously, but since there are going to be a few key differences between them, mostly differences that have to do with things like styling, we're just going to write them from scratch, and this will also give us a little bit more experience working with this sort of component. So to get started here, let's create two more pages inside our pages folder. We're going to say new file, and we're going to say login page, and we're going to create a create account page as well. And just as a side note here, if you're following along with your IDE, you're probably going to want to check out a new branch in your directory down here, right? Just to make sure that any changes that you make when you're adding Firebase Auth, to make sure that you can undo those if you want to see how to add some kind of other auth provider later on. Okay, so I'd recommend checking out a new branch in Git to make sure that those changes are isolated. Okay, so let's start off with our login page here. This one's going to be pretty straightforward. What we're going to do is we're going to start off here by importing the use state hook from React. Okay, we'll be using that to keep track of the values inside the inputs on this page. We're also going to import the link component from React Router DOM. Okay, we'll be using that to basically link our login page to our create account page, and we'll be doing the same thing in reverse on the create account page. And those are the two main things for now. Chances are we'll be importing a few other things a little later on. So let's create our component now. We're going to say export const login page equals, and it's not going to take any props. What it's going to do is we're just going to create two new state variables for the email and password. So const email set email equals use state, and const password set password equals use state. And of course, the starting value for both of those is an empty string. So the next thing that we're going to do here is define the JSX for our component. So we'll say return, and we're going to put all of this inside a React fragment. The top of this page will say something like login. Okay, and you can either do that as one word like that or two words like that. And underneath this, we're going to have our email and password inputs. So let's create those. We're going to say input. The type of this first one is going to be email. The placeholder for this, we'll just put in a fake email or something like that. We'll say johndoe@gmail.com, just to show the user what that's supposed to look like. And then we'll say class name equals full width and space below. This will basically make sure that this input is 100% of its container wide, and that it also leaves a little bit of space below so that it's not right on top of the element that comes below it. Okay, and we're going to have to add classes for those to our index.css file. So we'll go into here. We're just going to add full width. So we'll say dot full width. We're going to say width 100%. And then we're going to create another class called space below, which will have a margin bottom of, we'll just do something like 8 pixels. And one last thing here is that for our inputs and text areas, we're going to want to basically set the box sizing of these to border box so that they'll work correctly with the full width class here. So don't worry too much about that if you haven't had experience with this yet. We're just going to say box sizing border box, and that'll just make it the correct width. Okay, so going back to our login page, now that we've added those styles, let's add another input below this one, which will be the password input. So we'll say input type equals password, placeholder equals, and we'll just do something like enter your password. Okay, and below that, we'll give it the same class names. We'll say full width and space below, and that should make it look nice. Okay, so we'll just close that tag. And then underneath it, we're going to have a button that says login. So we'll say button. For now, we're just going to give it the text login, and the button is going to have the same classes as we saw above with our input. We're going to say class name equals full width and space below. And finally, the last thing that we're going to put on this page is a link to the create account page in case the user doesn't have an account already. And that's going to look like this. We're going to say link to create account. And inside here, we'll say something like create an account here. Okay, so that's our login page. Let's just bind these two inputs now to our state variables. So you're probably already familiar with how to do this, so we're just going to say value equals email, onChange equals e, set email, e.target.value. And we're going to do the same thing for our password input here, except with the password state variable. So we'll just say value equals password and set password, e.target.value. And that should be it for our login page. So let's take a look at what this page actually looks like in the context of our application. And before we do that, what we're going to do is we're actually going to copy and paste some of the code from the secret routes that we created earlier. And by secret routes, I mean the components that we created to keep authenticated users from accessing the login and create account pages, and the component that we created for making sure only authenticated users could access, restricted pages. So those were the auth route and unauth route components. So what I'm going to do is inside the source folder here, I'm actually going to create a new folder, which I'll call auth. This will basically just contain the auth-related components and logic in our application. And inside here, we're going to create two new files. One is going to be authroute.js, and the other is going to be unauthed.js. And what I'm going to do is just copy and paste the code over from when we implemented these routes earlier, right? When we were first taking a look at Firebase auth and how to make restricted routes. So that code's going to look like this for auth route. I'm just going to copy and paste it. So you should do the same thing here, either copying and pasting the code from the GitHub repo, or if you followed along and wrote this code previously, you can get it from there as well. So the unauth route, we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to say copy paste and put it in this unauthed route here. Okay, so we've created those two routes, so let's actually display our login page inside our app component now. What we're going to do is basically import both of those route components up at the top here by saying import auth route from auth/auth route. And same thing for unauth route. We're going to say unauth route from auth/unauth route. Okay, and basically we're going to want to display the login page inside an unauth route because we only want unauthenticated users to be able to access it. So let's go down here, and I suppose we'll just put it down at the bottom for now. We'll say unauth route. And inside here, we're just going to specify the path, which will be /login. And then what we'll do is put our login page inside of here, which we'll need to import also. My IDE just did that for me automatically. And that should be all we need to do in our app component. But while we're at it, why don't we convert the rest of these route components to the appropriate routes? Now, all of these, in fact, are going to be auth routes. So what you can do if you want to is just do a find and replace, and you'll want to find route with this little triangle bracket before it to make sure that you're only getting the components that are called just plain route. And we're going to replace those with auth route. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That should be all we need there. And we're going to have to do the same thing with the closing tags. So we'll say /route, /auth route, and we'll do the same thing there. Okay, so before this will actually work, you may have noticed that if you open up the auth route and unauth route again, they're relying on this use user custom hook that we created earlier when we were first talking about Firebase auth. Now, when we built this hook, I mentioned that one of the big benefits of it is that it allows all of our components to share, the Firebase user and to subscribe to changes in the user's logged in state. But there are other ways to do that. So in order to avoid having to recreate this component from scratch or copy and paste it, what we're actually going to do is create a context that will handle the Firebase user for us. Now, we'll get to that a little later, but for now what we're going to do, since we haven't yet added Firebase to this front-end application, is we're just going to say const is loading equals false and const user equals, we'll say null. Okay, so that'll just make sure that this route actually displays its contents like normal. Now for the auth route, what we're going to do is we're just going to do the same thing so that it will automatically redirect back to the login page. So instead of having this custom hook here, we're going to say const is loading equals false and const user equals null. So again, it will automatically redirect back to the login page. So the only thing that we'll be able to look at currently is the login page. Okay, so let's remove also our imports for use user because that hook doesn't exist. Let's run our application and see what our login page looks like. We're going to say npm run start and hit enter. And that'll open up our application here, and oops, it looks like we have an error here from Axios, so let's go back to our favorites provider. Oops, favorites provider component is what I want. You know what? I think that the problem is that I just need to run npm install, because I was working on another branch that didn't have Axios on it, and when I checked out this branch, basically you have to refresh node modules since node modules aren't committed to GitHub by default. Don't worry if that didn't make sense to you, but that should have fixed that error for me. So we'll say npm run start, and let's see if it works now. Okay, and sure enough, we see this login page here. Everything is looking good so far. This thing takes us to the create account page, which doesn't yet exist. And yeah, everything's looking good so far. So anyway, what we've done here is created the basic login page with styling that makes it look fairly good in this app, I think. And we've also seen how to basically bring those two route components from before, the auth route and unauth route, into our front-end application. So far, right, if we try and distill down some basic concepts from what we've done so far, when we're converting over an application to have user authentication, the first things that we're going to have to do are, one, create a login and create account page. Okay, so we'll just say create account pages. And two, we'll need to create restricted routes. Okay, these are two things that pretty much every user authenticated application has to have. So, it makes sense to add those right up front. Okay, so I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.